Canto 32 of the Purgatory continues in this altered state of consciousness that Dante, the pilgrim, is now in, having drunk from the waters of the Lethe, which has freed him from the burden of himself and has meant that he's able to drink in the, the love flowing from Beatrice's eyes. He's still quite caught up in that at the beginning of this canto. But the canto also extends its reach very substantially, taking in not just Dante's state and particular story, but extending its gaze to embrace the whole of human history. It kind of opens onto an expose of what you might call the lesser mysteries of divine human interaction. I'm using the phrase there that comes from the Platonic tradition, comes from what Diotima the priestess says to Socrates in the Symposium, that before revealing the higher mysteries, which she feels he won't be able to grasp right now, she's going to reveal lesser mysteries, which have more directly to do with his own experience of earthly life, but give them a spiritual inside that expands them to the point where they're seen from the divine point of view. He can just about grasp that, Diotima thinks, of Socrates in the Symposium. And in some ways, I think that there's a parallel here, that Beatrice, a bit like Diotima, is showing Dante a bit like Socrates, and then also extension us as well, something of where things are at in relation to the divine human creation story. And I think it's supposed to be read not just as an allegory, which is how many of the commentators treat particularly the second part of this canto. They look at all the details, which we'll go through, that Dante offers and says this must mean that, the other must mean something else. Well, maybe that is one way it can be read, but I think it's supposed to be read more freely and fluidly as well, that particular moments in history are also just symptoms or byproducts of deeper, more general tendencies that have unfolded through the life of the creation, through the life of humanity, in terms of its turning away, seeking, stumbling, falling from the fullness of the human vocation, which is nothing less than gazing on the fullness of God, taking that fullness into itself, and so becoming an incarnation of the divine as part of the glory of creation. Dante, the poet, in this canto is giving us a multifaceted picture of how particularly that hasn't worked out. And it's an appropriate moment to do that. We're reaching the end of the Purgatory. We've been very focused on Dante, the person's struggles at this point in the story, having been through the Inferno, having climbed the Purgatory. So too, you might say this is a moment to stand back and give the big history that has led to the point that Dante finds himself in that history. What is it on the largest possible scale that has led to the situation where souls are trapped in hell, souls are struggling on Mount Purgatory? Where does he find himself at his particular moment in history at the beginning of the 14th century? And I think by extension, because the Divine Comedy still speaks so profoundly to us, it's a chance to have a bit of a stock take as to where we find ourselves at the beginning of the 21st century, 700 years on. Can what Beatrice shows Dante in this canto speak to us of our not just personal state and struggles and desire to transform, but also our culture, particularly insofar as it is a Christian culture? Where has that now finds itself? I'm quite keen, as I've said a few times throughout my discussions, on the idea that consciousness really does change. It does evolve and unfold throughout human history. I think that's why there is a Christian dispensation at all. It caught a moment of human unfolding within the divine bigger story, and that's why it became so popular, because it helped people to understand what was happening to them as human beings on a sort of descent that's also an ascent and return to the divine. Dante, I think, in his time sensed something quite new emerging in the 14th century, um, which we now call the early stage of the Renaissance. So we kind of recognize it too, that something different was happening. And there's quite a profound sense following on from the scientific revolution that something new and different is happening in our times. So we can look back and read this canto again to see whether it illuminates that sense of a new stage of consciousness unfolding, evolving, emerging. Um, this chap Owen Barfield was keenly onto that, makes the case for it as a true reading of history, not just a flat reading of history that sees it as one thing after another, but sees a kind of inner story to history with its own intimate, immanent but transcendent dynamic there. I mean, do look elsewhere on my website if you want more about that story. I've gone to it at some length elsewhere. But for now, let's return to the canto. It begins with Dante still gazing into Beatrice's eyes. He says how he was making up for the 10-year gap between Beatrice's death, which was in 1290, and this moment in the Divine Comedy, which is set in the year 1300. And he was caught in its net. He couldn't take his eyes away from it. He was beginning to descend into what you might call a divine madness. He recognizes that Beatrice had exchanged her earthly life for the fullness of life, of which the earthly and her beauty was just a reflection. And now he's trapped in it, caught in its net, is a metaphor he uses. It's a bit like those experiences when you are actually overwhelmed by a divine vision in life, whether it be the sight of a sunrise or something far more dramatic, maybe psychedelic, maybe paranormal. You don't know what is happening, even though it feels tremendous. And interestingly, the three virtues of faith, hope, and love spot what's happening, and they say, stop now, stop gazing into Beatrice's eyes. I think the significance of this is, faith, hope, and love, the virtues, inhabit us. They become incarnate in us as human beings, no doubt elsewhere in the cosmos and in the heavens as well. But they sense that Dante is beginning to lose touch with himself, and so they feel they won't be able to hold and shape and be manifest in him. So they feel the kind of danger, the risk of this divine madness, this love that is overtaking him in an unsettling, unsteady way. And so they say stop, and they turn his eyes away from Beatrice. And indeed, Dante says he realizes that he had become blind. He couldn't, you might say, understand what he was seeing. He couldn't really see what he was seeing. He was just caught in the dazzle. And so it's just as well that these three virtues, these three goddesses, as Dante calls them here, are looking out for him, and they rescue him from plunging too deeply and too quickly into the pool. This is what he's going to learn through the paradise, so it's also a little prophecy of what is going to unfold when we get to that. He's in this innocent state. You might say he's a bit like the angels who are just born into the divine glory, except that's a dangerous state for human beings to be in, because it means that we lose our freedom, we lose our sense of ourselves as humans, and for a true incarnation we must become fully human, completely human in order to then become a receptacle completely for the divine, so that, as you know, the biblical imagery, the biblical words put it, our I amness can reflect the divine I am. That's what the heart of the incarnation is. Jesus being the forerunner of that, who becomes fully human, fully transmitting the divine, and making that way, showing that way for all of us. You've seen it in Beatrice, and we're beginning to sense that is part of what Dante is going to discover in the Paradise. And as Dante is coming around from his vision, he realizes that the procession is moving off in a new direction. Remember that there's all these elders here, there's the virtues dancing, there's the griffin pulling the chariot, there's the candlesticks, all that is still present, except they're now doing an about turn, and there's quite a sense of a sort of march. There's a military sense in the description that Dante gives here. He even talks about how the chariot turns around and they follow on the wheel that turns the lesser arc, the inside of the turn. This partly sets up the allegorical readings of this canto, because it can be interpreted as the church militant on earth, as the phrase puts it. And there's something in that, but I'm not going to cling too closely and literally to that, too formulaically to that, to try and understand the wider dynamics which are going on as well. And I think what this at this point means is that the procession is now moving off with new intent, with fresh intent. And Beatrice says explicitly later in the canto, this is not just about your journey, Dante, now. This is about something which you will see and record and report, which is for the whole of humanity when you return for the last part of your life, before you join me in the heavenly city. That is what he's going to see now. It's partly also for Statius. Don't forget that Statius is with them too. And very interestingly, underlining that, when they've travelled a bit of a distance through the forest, Dante describes it as the distance an arrow might be leashed times 3. When they get there, Beatrice steps out of the chariot. I think the chariot here is shown as the receptacle of the divine human, the receptacle of the divine spirit into human life. And now it's empty. As it were, it becomes the receptacle of humanity as a whole, how that can receive the divine, maybe other individuals, how maybe even we might receive the divine, and perhaps creation and the whole human story as well, how that can be. Now the chariot can now be seen as a receptacle, which is more or less capable of receiving that. And indeed, as the canto unfolds, various things are going to be seen flying in, crashing in, storming the chariot, as if they are more or less failed attempts to receive the divine incarnation, in contrast to Beatrice, who certainly in Dante's perception has been the fullest, most perfect receptacle of the divine that certainly he ever knew or saw. So we're ready to see something new, and the setting that they've come to is by a tree, and it's a tree without fruit or leaf. It's also one of these trees, like we've seen in Purgatory before, that grows larger, more expansively outward the higher it gets. This suggestion that these are supernatural trees that grow more richly and fully the closer they get to heaven, unlike earthly trees that are fullest lower down where they're closer to the earth. The supernatural, miraculous nature of this leafless, fruitless tree is underlined. Dante makes a nice reference to India, saying it's larger than the trees which he's heard live there. Remember, Dante's always reaching out beyond just Christendom. We've heard reference to the Ganges before. This story is told through Christian eyes, but it's supposed to be a Christian version of the story which maybe in many different ways, is for humanity as a whole. And the griffin, this creature that lives both on earth and in heaven, is praised for not eating the bark of this tree, and not becoming poisoned by it in his belly. And the griffin replies and says, yes, that is how I have sown the seeds of righteousness or justice. And I think that means harmony, how he's preserved the balance between earth and heaven. And we're getting the sense that this is a reinterpretation of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil from the biblical story of Eden, given this slightly different, slightly more expansive twist here. We are being invited perhaps to consider Eden as one way of telling the story of an older time when humanity was in balance more with the divine. This fits with the story told by Owen Barfield, what he calls original participation, when he fails. The evidence is that peoples knew of the gods directly. They knew that life was flooded with meaning, and the challenge was how to navigate this flood of meaning, how to relate to the gods. Their question was very different from ours, which is, are there even any gods? Is life got any kind of meaning? So we're being taken back to what you might call a kind of prelapsarian state now, I think, when something has died, the fruits which would be all around, the leaf growth which would be all around, the sense of divine presence and meaning which would be all around, that has gone. I think this is a time when incarnation meant something different from what it's come to mean in the Christian dispensation. If you like, God was incarnate in creation self-evidently, and it was before a fall, before an alienation, which has the upside of making us much, much keener of our own individuality, because we get thrown onto ourselves and have to struggle and make something of our lives, rather than just ride this wave of meaning. We ate, if you like, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which, though felt like a fall in one way, was also a new birth in another. The happy fault, as the Christian mystical tradition remembers it, that led to the divine incarnation in Christ, which led to the divine incarnation in Beatrice, and is going to be the path that Dante will follow when we get to the paradise. But for now, beneath the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in its fruitless and leafless state, we're returned to the prelapsarian condition. Because what happens is that the griffin puts the pole of the chariot, this living receptacle, against the tree, and the tree bursts back into life. It's said that it fruits like a tree, blossoms in the spring, and in a very beautiful way its leaf and fruits are described as being somewhere in between the colour of a red rose and the colour of a deep violet, a kind of purple colour, full of the aboriginal vitality and freshness. And very interestingly, Dante hears a hymn being sung, which he doesn't recognise. He says it's like no hymn that was sung on earth. And I think that's because it's the music of this older dispensation that he's being given a glimpse of right now. So he literally doesn't understand it. It is spoken in a different language that's not the language of his period. It's not the language of our period, when we have this post-lapsarian condition with all its downside, but with all its promise as well. And it lulls him into a sleep. He literally falls out of consciousness. He can't maintain a grip on awareness, on being awake in this state. And so he falls into a mystical sleep. It's a kind of prequel to our awareness, our times. The chariot, the receptacle of divine life, was filled in a completely different way, interacted with nature in a completely different way. And Dante can't hold on to it. in a way, it's another kind of divine madness. I think different from the flood of Beatrice's love at the beginning of the canto. This hymn, this vision he's seeing now, discombobulates him in a different way. And he describes falling into the sleep um, in a very interesting way. He tells the story from Ovid of how Syrinx was chased by Pan and escaped by becoming a reed. Pan is a kind of divine mania too, and Syrinx has to disappear in order to escape it. And in some ways, Dante has to disappear in the sleep in order to not be overwhelmed by this new, almost psychedelic revelation. Um, and then he comes round. He's been woken by the sympathetic lady, whose name we still don't know, who's been so supportive and helped him so much through these last few cantos. He wakes to her words saying, "What's happening? Rise." And in the poem, Dante the poet says this was like the words that Christ used when Peter, James, and John witnessed the Transfiguration and similarly became overwhelmed and fell asleep. And Jesus says to them, "Rise, do not be afraid." And the word rise, of course, is also hugely significant because Jesus tells people to rise from the dead, from that other state of consciousness in the New Testament. And so the allusion here, I think, is to, maybe the transfiguration of Peter, James, and John, whatever else it might have meant, it was them catching sight of the eternal nature of the divine word, that aspect of life which doesn't change, which is the source of all unfolding, not the unfolding itself. And it was too much for Peter, James, and John, who could only hold on to make some sense of their consciousness, their state of being, much as it has been too much for Dante. But nonetheless, he does wake and rise, and he immediately actually goes into a panic. The shock of coming round from this strange other place, because he can't see Beatrice, which is significant because in a way that's right. He's been in this prelapsarian state, this time before the particular incarnations of figures like Jesus, but also individuals like Beatrice. So he did lose sight of her, but it says that he was allowed to regain sight of her, she who rules his mind, who orientates his life. She's described as he's entering consciousness now as he knows it, in this great telling of divine human history. We're now into the Christian period. It's also signified because the griffin has returned to the heavens. If the griffin represents this older, spontaneous harmony between heaven and earth, he now has returned to the heavens, signalling that the vision is moving into a different phase. But the virtues are still there. These qualities which we individuals need to incarnate, to inhabit, to know as part of our life, if we're going to find a way through to all that's promised, all that's possible of this new period of life. They're here. So Dante is now awake again. He's able to take in, at least in the sense of recording, what is seen. And Beatrice underlines it again and says, look, this is what happened next. This is the story since the fall of Eden in the postlapsarian condition. The story of our consciousness, our times now. And it moves through 7 stages. Now again, the allegorical reading interprets these stages quite literally, trying to map them onto actual events in history. And maybe there's something in that. I'm going to look at them almost as 7 moments, 7 movements that characterize Dante's time, characterize our time. And the first one sees what Dante the poet calls the bird of Jove swooping down onto the chariot. And as it descends through this great tree, it rips off leaves and creates a kind of mess in the receptacle. And I think that this is the moment where the old dispensation before Christianity, hence the reference to Jove, tries to make sense of the new story, of the new receptacle, the new moment. And it makes a bit of a mess of it. It's inclined to rip things up. Um, Dante the poet says that the chariot rocks like a ship in a high sea. It's a very unsteady period. But maybe it's one that's necessary. The spirit, you might say, has to descend again, and things have to be worked out. So whilst it feels unsteady, it's not wholly bad. What happens next in the vision is that Dante sees a fox running into the chariot. It's lean and it's hungry. And Beatrice actually scolds the fox, chastises it, and sends it away. And I think this is another moment when you're trying to grasp something new, when you try and, you might say, consume, understand, digest it too quickly, out of your hunger for divine life, out of a kind of spiritual necessity, a bit like the hungry fox. You use perhaps your cunning a bit too speedily, and so misunderstand quite what's going on. And so that's a kind of mistaken moment too that can lead to trouble. So hence Beatrice scolding the fox and it scuttling off. The third moment happens. This happens quite quickly towards the end of the canto. And the third moment is when the eagle appears again. And this time it descends into the chariot and kind of makes a nest of the chariot, but it's a nest of its own plumage, Dante says. And I think this is the moment when, in the Christian dispensation, the church particularly feels it understands the receptacle that it's been given, feels it understands divine life. But what it's actually doing is making a nest of its own making, with its own plumerage, its own pomp, you might say, its own glory. And it's losing sight of the receptacle that lies underneath this veneer of church magnificence, very evident in Dante's time, evident still in our time now, how the church can take on a life of its own, and that can feel like a vitality and awareness of things, but actually unwittingly it's becoming uncoupled from the ground of its being, which is divine life itself. Unsurprisingly, that's not sustainable, and it leads to a fourth state that Dante now sees. He sees it as a dragon coming up from underneath the chariot and forcing its tail through the bottom of the chariot, which is a great sting. And this is an image of the ground itself being rent asunder, of things splitting and dividing apart, of real damage, people getting stung. And the dragon is, of course, a bit Satan-like, seeming to be a source of life, but actually being a source of poisonous life, being derivative and fallen and perverted, a version of the life of God. But it is a kind of life, and this moves into a fifth stage, which is where the chariot, Dante sees, gets covered with all sorts of new growth, new foliage. It's described as an undergrowth of good intentions, but it's actually degenerate. It's actually, even in its seeming vitality, falling away from divine life. Even in its seeming good presence in the world, has become too secular and so cut off from that which can truly feed it. Dante was wondering about that in his time. I think we feel it very powerfully in our time, where we assume that the material world is the ground and source of all life, and in a way it produces amazing blessings and amazing benefits that the material take on life can, from longevity and good health to lots of comforts, lots of pleasures, but at the same time it feels like it's hollowing out. And I think that quite aptly characterises a lot of maybe our times, which people do feel that both the church and the world, for all its activity, for all its efforts, can't quite connect with life. And so it feels like a garden kind of rampaging out of control. And sure enough, this leads to a sixth stage in Dante's vision, which is where the chariot grows monstrous heads and it becomes unrecognisable. It's really ceasing to be a receptacle for divine life at all. And sure enough, that moves Dante into the seventh and last aspect of the image that he sees, where he sees now in the chariot a woman and a man. The woman looks like a harlot, he says. It's full of lust, full of the desire for pleasures, full of the desire to possess and to manipulate. And the man is like a giant. He, I think, represents power, and they kiss every so often in the chariot. But when he sees her looking at Dante, he who represents a new life, a new light, um, which I think is at the heart of Dante's great effort and great vision in writing the Divine Comedy, to launch a new dispensation that can be free of all these falls, of all these perversions, of all these failed attempts to be a receptacle for the divine. Well, when the lustful figure sees Dante and sort of half wants it, half desires it, but doesn't know how to want it aright, well, the power figure, the giant, sees her doing this and uses all his strength to stop it happening, to stop her gazing on him. And so the canto ends with the chariot being untethered from the tree and being driven off into the depth of the forest. Dante says that he looks and sees it no more. It's a kind of final severance, a final fall, as the giant human will has deliberately torn itself apart from the new promise, which all that's happening for Dante represents. It's a damning indictment of how Dante saw his times. But of course, like the original fall that he saw seemingly quite a long time ago now in the earliest prelapsarian states of this vision, that fall in the Divine Comedy is only one side of new blessing, of divine ascent. And so, although the canto ends with quite a devastating image, the response that you feel in Beatrice and those around is as much one of lament. It's the sense that this is a tragedy that they've seen, but a tragedy that might make for new possibility. Another chapter in this huge story of the divine and the human, of the creator and the creation. So we're left hoping for some of that at the end of Canto 32.